All right, so we are a unit of the University System of Georgia. We are the permanent repository, well, the repository for permanent government records and historical documents on Georgia history. We have a collection of more than 90,000 cubic feet with more than 260 million documents. And cubic feet simply is, if you think of a banker's box, just think of 90,000 of those sitting in our vaults. So yeah, we have a pretty big collection. We also, as a reference archivist, we work to, as well as our conservation staff and the rest of the team, we work to make these historic records available to the public in various formats, i.e. Physical as well as digital. And we will see examples of some of the digital items later in the presentation. So there are two important factors of finding information in general: time and location. So if you were to call us here at the archives or submit to us through our Ask an Archivist form a question and you don't provide these two pieces of information, that's going to be our first question to you. Because time and location really determines whether or not records exist, and as well as what format they exist in and where they can be found. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those two important factors. So why is this the case? Well, the availability of records. Some municipalities began to collect records at different dates. For example, the state of Georgia started collecting vital records, i.e. birth records and death records, in 1919. However, the city of Atlanta, Savannah, Columbus, to name a few, they started collecting those important records prior to 1919. So if you have an ancestor who was born or who died in particular municipalities, there is a chance that there is a record documenting that event. There are also record loss events that we have to contend with due to courthouse fires, natural disasters, and other things like that. So the most recent courthouse fire we've had in Georgia was in Hancock County in 2014. And so luckily, because of technology, there are some ways in which they have been able to find copies of those records that were physically lost due to the fire. And then also missing records. There may be some gaps in the different records that are available. And so that's why time is very important. So if you look at the different dates on the left side of the screen, those are some important dates in genealogy. 2022, of course, is when the 1950 census will become available. 1941 is the war to draft. 1919 is, as I said, the beginning of the collection of death and birth records in the state of Georgia. In 1870, it's the first census that a large majority of African Americans were listed by name in the federal census. Why else is it important? Research location specifics. We touched upon this a little bit, but you also have to keep in mind creation dates of counties. In the state of Georgia, we created a ton of counties. We have a total of 159, which is second only to Texas in the United States. And so, of course, all the way up to 1924, roughly, give or take, the boundaries changed. So you have to be mindful of the time frame so that you know where exactly to go looking for those records. Again, the dates for the vital records, we talked about that, as well as the laws governing the vital records. You have to know, when do these vital records become available to the public? Not only vital records, but also census records. We know that census records are released every 72 years after they took place. So of course, 2022 is the next year that a census record will be released to the public. And again, record loss events, courthouse fires. There's also the location and format of the records, and we touched upon this in our last section, where you have to figure out, is it in physical format or is it in digital? Is it in a federal repository, a state repository, or a local one? Is it in a state archives? Is it in a state agency like Vital Records? Or is it on the county level like in a courthouse, or maybe even county archives? Maybe it's in an academic library, special collections, general archives, public libraries, local archives, again, historical societies and genealogical societies, and it may even be in the last place you think to look. So there are some resources such as the Digital Public Library of America, Archive Grid, and NUCMUC, which are some resources that can help you uncover some of these items that should be in Georgia, but may have ended up in Texas for whatever reason, or even at Duke University in North Carolina, who knows. So all of that being said, some of the tools that you're going to need to capture this information about your ancestors in your research or whoever you're researching is you can start simply with pencil and paper. You can write down the information on a sheet of paper. You can create timelines for the individuals or even the family units, or you can use other resources such as Midwest Genealogy Center, which is one of my favorite resources. If you've taken any of my presentations, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to mention them because they have fillable PDFs, and we're going to take a look at that website. But then there's also another tool you can use to help get you started with trying to figure out the vital records dates for your particular locale, which is the CDC's Where to Write for Vital Records. There's also the Red Book and a Family Search Research Wiki. So all of those resources are listed on your handout, as well as links to the individual resources. So we're going to hop out of the presentation, and we're going to give you a quick glimpse at some of these resources. And so I'm going to hop back just to show you how I end up at most of my links, because I don't keep these memorized. So I just remember, hey, I'm going to Midwest Genealogy Center and I'm looking for their forms. So I can just do a Google search, or I can search from my URL. And then I'm going to select this link, which is going to take me to their forms homepage. And here I find the pedigree chart, the 4-generation chart, which is a pedigree chart, the 6-generation chart, and the family group sheet or the family unit chart. And so I'm just going to highlight these two because these are the very two foundational pieces or forms for genealogy so that you can capture information about a family unit or individual's pedigree all in one place. And so here, if you notice on this document, you see the little blue boxes. With these little blue boxes, you can actually type in information on this document, and you can download it and save it to your desktop or save it to your computer, and you can pull it back up and you can add more information as you gather it. So I really like this form because it allows me to have this chart and have it neatly typed, and I can update it as more information becomes available. And like I said, they also have the 6-generation chart, which is one of my favorites because I'm constantly using this and updating it, as well as the 4-generation chart. And that one's a little bit smaller. So if you really want to wow someone with a little bit of information, this would be the way to go. But if you wanted to give a longer view, the 6-generation chart would be an option as well. So if you're looking for information about a specific location, one of the earlier resources that you could have used that they now have digitized and put completely online is called the Red Book. And the Red Book basically allows you to look up your state. We're going to focus on Georgia. And then you can go learn more information about the state of Georgia. They even have the Georgia County resources, which provides you with the key to the map so that you know exactly where these locations are on the map. And it provides you with these important dates over here, the started dates of their various vital records. So this is a very useful tool for not only the state of Georgia, but it also covers all 50 states. So when you get an opportunity, hopefully you will take some time to play around with this resource. I apologize for all these little ads that have popping up, but this is a very useful resource that can be utilized for your research. Additionally, Family Search Wiki, you can't really shake a stick at this one. This one has information on nearly every topic that you can think of related to genealogy. And so if you were interested in a particular locale, such as for me, Warren County, Georgia, is one of my locations or research locations, I can go here, click on Warren County, Georgia, hit enter, and it pulls up a lot of information about this particular location, including a description, who it was named for, the location of the county courthouse, those important dates, the vital records, marriage, land, and probate. It also talks about record loss. We talked about this particular thing. So I would know that the deed books from 1817 to 1844 were destroyed. So that's good information to know. So if I was looking for deed books for that time frame, I may be out of luck. But even if you see something like this, a note like this, you still should go and do more research to see if there's any repository that might have copies that may have survived. But with it happening this early on, the chances are slim, but who knows? You never know. And so, like, they had another fire in 1909. However, there was no record damage reported, and that's important. And so this is another great resource that you can use to learn more about your research location. So we're going to hop back over to our presentation. And we're going to give you an example of how you can use these things. And I know you're probably thinking, oh, this has nothing to do with the archives. This is just a preliminary work that we encourage our researchers to do so that when you come to us, you will be prepared to provide us with the information that we need in order to better assist you. So for this example, this is my great-grandfather on my father's side. His name is Okie Collins. He was born in 1914 and he died in 1979. He was born in Warren County, Georgia, and he lived and died in Atlanta, Fulton County, Georgia. So this is just some general information I know about him. So using this information, I was able to create a skeleton for his life. So 1914, of course, he was born. 1979, he died. And so those are the beginning and end pieces of his timeline. However, I know that between the time that he lived, I have at least 3 census records that I should be able to find him in that are open to the public, 1920, 1930, and 1940. Also, I know that he lived in a time of a draft. Well, actually during 2 drafts, but of course he was too young for World War I. So for World War II, he should have a draft card. So I have a date for him there as a placeholder. And so these are just some very basic information about him. So this lets me know where he was in time. And one question I have is, when did he move to Atlanta, Fulton County? So that can be a research question. But now I have a better idea about where to look for him for more records in certain times in his life. So armed with that information, I can now come to the Georgia Archives and ask my questions because I'm a little more informed about this particular individual. And so we're now going to talk about and go actually see some of the resources we have available online, available to you to help you with your research. So again, we're going to hop out of the PowerPoint and we're going to go right back to the website. So you should be able to see Google again. So if you could just let us know by saying yes, you can see it.
Some are here and some are not. Just go on. Just go, you know.
So, all right. We are now at the Georgia Archives main page, and we're going to visit 3 different locations on this page. Actually, several, but the 3 main areas is visit, research, and featured content, which is right here, which has a link to 4 different areas. Okay. So under visit and programs is where you're going to find quite a bit of information, including our past presentations, because due to the pandemic, we have had to go to the virtual environment for our presentations. And so we have here links to our past lunch and learns. And they're really, really good. If you have not had an opportunity to listen to them, please take the time to do so because there's some very interesting topics, and some of which include handouts. And they are time well spent because I have viewed all of them myself, And I have learned quite a bit. And so for a shameless plug, we're just going to gloss over the virtual vault today. But if you wanted to learn more about discovering your roots using the virtual vault, take a look at our first virtual lunch and learn. And make sure to try out the scavenger hunt just so that you can get more familiar with the resource. So in addition to those past presentations, we also have some of the other presentations as well as the handouts for those that you may want to take a look at, especially this one right here that talks about the slave laws of Georgia, as well as another handout that is packed full of information about African American resources that we have available. One other resource to highlight here is our online exhibit. And the very first one deals with primary sources, examples of primary sources that document enslaved and free persons of color here in Georgia. So when you get an opportunity, take a look at this. There's some really interesting information provided here in a very visual form, which highlights various examples of the records that we have. So the next section is research and research help. So if you're following along on your handout, it's going to be on page 2, the second bullet. And here we have online research guides that help you to learn more about various topics, including vital records. So remember how I told you that some of the municipalities began collecting records prior to the 1919, which is the date for the state. If you click on birth records, you get information about the vital records, their location as well as their phone number. But then you'll also get a list of some pre-1919 birth records. You have the county as well as the time frame in which it covers. And then in 1875, there was a Vital Records Act where some counties did collect birth records during this time. So if you're one of the lucky ones who have someone born during 1875 and then comes in some cases a little bit later for these particular locations, then you will have a birth record. If you don't see your county listed, you won't have one. Additionally, there are other cities like Macon, Savannah, Atlanta, Columbus that also collected these records prior to 1919. In the case of Atlanta, they began recording births in 1896. So that's quite a few years prior to the 1919. So if you wanted to see if there was a birth record for your ancestor, this is the repository or the local agency that you need to contact in order to get a copy of it. So additionally, going back to research help, there are a few others I wanted to highlight, including documenting family history in Georgia. We have documenting marriages in Georgia, as well as African American resources. If you wanted to learn more about our militia districts, there's a document for that. If you have not taken an opportunity to read through these FAQs for our tax records, please do so, because there's actually a section on African Americans. And even though it's a section on African Americans, I would encourage you to read the entire thing, especially the second one, so that you can better understand the importance of finding tax records and utilizing them for your genealogy research. But of course, you do want to take a look at the African American research in Early Tax Digest. This is a record group that I'm actually looking at myself for my own personal research, and I'm learning a great deal more about how they can be utilized for genealogy purposes. And last but not least, is something that was created by the archive staff. I visited the State Archives at Alabama, and I noticed that they had a map that showed the creation dates and the record loss events on a handout. And I was like, if Alabama can do it, of course Georgia can do it. So along with assistance from my colleague Allison, we put together this resource that is now available to you online. So I have a copy of this already sitting at my desk on my wall, so I can keep referencing it often. And so the first side, or one side, is about the creation dates. The other side lists the courthouse disaster dates. And the ones that are shaded in denote record loss events. So you can actually get a pretty good image on the different record loss events. And there are some counties such as Wilkinson, Miller, Baker that had several years. Emmanuel is another one that had several years where they had courthouse fires. So this could be useful in informing you in terms of what records are available for your research. Okay? So we're going to hop back over to our main page, or actually we can just go back to any page on our website, because this part right here is a constant companion. And so here we're going to hop to the virtual vault, which again is the home of our digital resources for the Georgia Archives. There's a little bit of everything in here. If you have an opportunity, please take some time to go through here, go through this resource, because I'm learning stuff every time I use it, and I work here, and I've been here for more than 3 years, so that tells you something about how much stuff we have here. So some of the research, of course, you want to do maybe focus on African Americans, or maybe focus on a location. So just one note about the virtual vault: we have several collections that are keyword searchable, but we also have some that are browsing collections. And so one thing I want to highlight real quickly was some of the resources that you will receive when you look up African Americans. And so you have to play around with the searching, because one thing that I learned recently is that the virtual vault also acknowledges wildcards. So just with African Americans as a search term with the S, we have 937 items. But if we use an asterisk, we go up to 148,000 resources. And these resources include, as you can see, death certificates. So if you wanted to not have the death certificates listed, you can go here on the left where it says collections. You do show all. And then once you unselect the items that you don't want, you can click update, and there it goes from 148,000 down to 2,000, which is, in my opinion, a little bit more manageable. So here you're going to find a variety of things, including photographs. And I just have to highlight this particular item here while we're here and it shows up. This represents one of my favorite items in this collection. Not only because there is a beautiful picture of an African-American female from the 1940s, but this caption contains a boatload of genealogical information. And I just wish that there was something like this for my family members. This is just awe-inspiring. And the fact that we have it all spelled out here in the virtual vault, this is so awesome. And it looks like she was born in Douglas County in Georgia, but moved to Pennsylvania. So somebody in Pennsylvania might be looking for her and not realizing that there is a pretty deep and informative genealogical history contained in this virtual vault. And if they did a Google search, they won't find it, because Google doesn't go that deep in our virtual vault. But this is, for me, one of our more important pieces that contains genealogical information. So moving right along. So as I said before, if you want to learn more about the virtual vault, we have a Lunch and Learn dedicated to researching the roots in the vault that you can take a look at your leisure. So I'm going to hop back over here, going back to the Georgia Archives website, and I'm going to click on Finding Aids. So Finding Aids is our resource to allow you to search for the inventories for government records. So when you think Finding Aids, think about government agencies like the Department of Education, Department of Transportation, MARTA, things like that. And so as you can see here, one of our featured collections is the Negro Education Division, the Director's Subject Files. And so one of the projects that I've taken up during the pandemic is working on this particular classification to add more folder lists to the collections that we don't have folder lists. And I just recently completed the school surveys collection or sub-series, and there is a ton of stuff in the midst of the building plans, the floor plans for the various education institutions throughout the state, or the Black schools. There are also interesting pieces, including, because I know Washington High School is about to celebrate an anniversary, we have in our possession a copy of their 1941 senior student directory. And when I saw that, I was blown away by the amount of information it contained, and I was like, this is one of the best pieces in that particular collection. But there is a ton of information about the various schools that were being provided, information was being provided about them to the head of the education division, who was Robert Cousins. So that is one great collection that I hope at some point, if you're looking for information about schools in a particular research area, that you would take a look at, because there's a lot of information there. But not only can you look for various agencies, you can also look up different locales. So thanks to Ken Thomas, many of you know Ken Thomas because of his articles in the AJC. He also did one of our lunch and learns recently. We have quite a bit of information about Sapelo Island, which is one of the areas he worked on when he was in the historic preservation department. And so I'm looking for this particular one because I think it's a really fun collection that I plan to take a look at in my much later when I get an opportunity. So there is this one, and hopefully you guys can see it. In this particular collection here, the May Ruth Green Research Files, there are cemetery records for Behavior Cemetery on Sapelo Island. And that's just one piece of a lot of great information contained in some of these records. And once you click on the link, you'll get more information about exactly what's in there. Sapelo marriages A through Z. That is amazing. I want to go take a look at this collection right now. So let me stop because I'm getting distracted. I'm going down a rabbit hole. That's one of the great things about looking through our resources, is that sometimes you uncover some things that you never thought we might have. And so again, there are maps that provide you with an overview of the particular location. And there's quite a few other things in this collection that I'm sure someone who's interested in Sapelo Island might find useful for their various research purposes. So heading right back over, we're going to touch on the book and manuscript collection. And here there are some other resources that are available in our original format that you can actually take a look at now, even with us being closed for the pandemic. And some of these collections are really interesting, and I made note of a few. So if we get started just by typing in African American as a general topic, you'll see a variety of resources. And so what I wanted to do was come over here on the left-hand side. And location is important for this particular search because we want to restrict it to manuscripts only. And manuscripts are the original records that you can request access to using our Ask an Archivist form. So there are several records here with the search term African American included in this description. And so one I wanted to highlight was the Martha Cullum Midwifery Registry. And so this was an African American midwife, and it has a register. So in that register, there may be births. So if you have someone who is researching in Decatur County of African Americans, this might be a great resource for them to take a look at to see if the birth date for a child or for an ancestor is listed. So the important thing to remember on this particular page is this number right here, which we call the accession number or the consignment number. This number helps us to locate that material. So when you're requesting items from our manuscript collection, this number is what you will need to let us know. Or you can tell us the title of the collection, but this number is what we essentially will need to pull that item for you. One other thing to make note of is the physical description. The physical description will give you more information about how large this collection is. So this collection here is kind of small. It's one volume. So the volume could be a very small volume or it could be a very large one. But as you'll see in some of our other examples, you'll see the changes with the physical description. So one other example is some Sardis Primitive Baptist records. So here the same thing. You want to make note of the consignment number. Then when you scroll down to details, under contents, it provides you with information and the reason why it showed up in our African American search. And so this particular one, this collection contains the minute books and loose papers, and early membership records list names of both African American and white members. And so if you have someone who is researching in Walton County, which my husband is, this may be a resource you might want to take a look at just to see if any of your ancestors are listed. And again, the physical description for this is 6 volumes. All right, so one more. The James Murphy Hill Business Records. Thought this one was a very interesting one. So of course, the consignment number is important to note. Scroll down and you look at the contents, and here it looks like this was a individual who provided small business loans. And the archivist who processed this collection made note that in looking at the Atlanta City Directory in 1912, many of the names and addresses of the borrowers included were African American citizens. So just think anyone who has ancestors living in the city of Atlanta who may have been employed in these various occupations may want to come take a look at this particular resource so that they can see whether or not one of their ancestors does appear. Okay, so last but not least, and we're gonna kind of move forward a little rather quickly because I don't want to take away any time from DL's presentation. So last but not least, Historical Organizations Directory is a resource that we have available. So if you're looking for research institutions by county, by city, by organization name, or keyword, so we're going to go back to Warren County. This can help you find those other repositories that may be able to provide you with some information or resources that can help you with your research. So for Warren County, we only have one entry, and it's the Warren County Library. And so with that, you click on the link, you get general information about the organization as well as a link to that organization's website. All right, so we're going to hop right into some of our other resources. Georgia place names. So if you're like me, there are some interesting place names that you've uncovered in your research as you do research with the state of Georgia. One of them for me, just driving around the city, was Between. So in this resource, Georgia place names, you can actually look up the place name in a particular area. So i.e. Between. Let's see, hopefully I'm not scrolling too fast. Just getting down to Between. And you can learn more about the city. So it's a city in Walton County, tells you when it was settled, who was, and how it got its name. So I just thought that this was an interesting resource that you might find intriguing, that, you know, on those days that you have a little bit of time, you can read more about the various locale names in the state of Georgia. And all of these links are hyperlinked in your handout, so you don't have to do a search for them, but if you like, you can do that as well. So this one is one I really wanted to make sure you guys got a chance to see because it is one of my favorites. So if you've visited us before, and I'm hopping around just so I can get to the handout because I don't want to have to type all of this out because it's kind of long. But if you visited our resource, our repository, and learned that we do have statewide indexes for marriage, death, and divorce. And those, which are on microfiche here, you can actually find online, the whole thing online through the Georgia Government Publications. And so as mentioned in the handout, you have to type in this name exactly as you see it in order to get these search results. And so this is a complete list of those microfiche copies that we have downstairs. And so just to give you an idea, So of course, we're starting at 1998. And of course, 1998, those death records are restricted. And so if you want to see if a person died in a certain year, these index registers are great resources for that. And so one thing I wanted to make sure you made note of is how big these records are. So if when you click on view document images, be prepared to wait for a while because they're extremely large. Like this particular one is 2,500 pages and 5 PDF files, so it's pretty big. So just make sure that you have your coffee or whatever your drink of choice is. When you click on the link, you might have to go do something else just to wait for that to open up. But this resource is available to you wherever you have access to the internet and wherever you have time to wait, because like I said, it is very large. And of course, you can sort by title and by date ascending. So if you do that, you're going to see some of the earlier death indexes. So if you want to see if you had a death year and you just didn't know what the person died, these indexes would also be useful for that as well. Okay. Last but not least, Family Search. Family Search is one of our partners, and they have digitized, they work with us to microfilm a lot of our resources, and they are currently digitizing the microfilms that they have in their collection to make them available online for free. You just need an account that you can register with email. And so in order to get to these records that we're talking about here, you click on records and you're going to scroll down, click find a collection, click in the box. And when you start typing in a location, it's going to give you a list of various collections. And you can actually scroll through to see what various collections are available for that location. Or you can just continue to type in the name of the collection, and it's only going to display certain pieces of it, a certain piece of that list. And so Georgia Death Index and Georgia Deaths are three important collections for us, because this is where the full text keyword searchable version of Georgia death records are available up to 1943. And so we also have them a certain portion of this on our virtual vault. However, if you want the full run, this is the place that you want to go to. They also have Georgia probate records, which is a very important collection, especially when you're doing, once you get to the 1870 brick wall and you're looking for probate records, or even before then. They're here full text, but they're browsable. So you have to go by county. And then once you find your county, looking again at Warren County, it gives you the various types of records. So if you want to look at wills, or if you want to look at the inventories or the estate dockets, they're here for the time frames that they have listed. One last thing is catalog. Because as I said, they are digitizing a lot of their microfilm, or all their microfilm. And so here's a good way to learn what microfilm is available for your location or what resources are available. And this is the catalog for the Family History Library. So this is the catalog that captures everything that they have. So if we do it from the highest level down to the lowest, which is the state, then county, or actually US, then state, then county, and click on that and click search. It's going to bring up a list of different record groups. And so here, if we wanted to look at, let's say, vital records and see what they actually have. So they have marriage books, have marriage records, early marriage records, and some other things. So mostly marriage records. So if we click on the link, if we scroll down, it lets us know what format it's in, and right now this is only on microfilm, and it's only available at a Family History Center. But there are other resources that are available online, like the annual returns. We come here. This lets us know that it's a browsable image. If you were to see a magnifying glass next to it, that lets you know that it's keyword searchable. Okay? So that is the end of our online demonstrations. And so we're going to hop back over to our presentation. And I'm just going to display my contact information. There it is. And really quickly, just a few research tips. I'm going to do it in about 2 minutes, just to give you 5 minutes so you can ask questions. Make sure to learn the terms that refer to African Americans in historical documents. This is going to be very important because you want to know when we were considered colored, Negro, Black, mulatto, African American, and all of that. You also want to learn about the institutions and communities that are unique to African Americans in your research areas. So basically, you want to know what the Black communities were. You want to get familiar with the resources and how they denoted African Americans. Did they denote us with an asterisk, with a clipped edge, with a C, with a COL, that sort of thing. You also want to look at the back of the book. You want to look in the index, the end of the section. You want to look for the colored section, the colored book, just so you will be able to find resources related to African Americans. Sometimes it's not as clearly labeled as you would like. There are some tax digests that are the tax digest for the county, but when you look at the table of contents, it does not list any of the African American pages that are typically at the back. So you really want to take a look at the back of the book to see if that's where the African American information is listed. Be prepared to look at historical documents, county history, town histories, and other things, indexes for resources that do not include African Americans or mention very little about the African American experience in them. For whatever reason, they weren't included. For whatever reason, they thought there really isn't a need to include much information about them, if any. So that's something that you just have to be prepared for. When you think about digital content from the various research repositories, think of it as a dangling carrot. There's really no way for any repository to put everything that they have available online. So the things that we put online are things to entice you to come see us. So that is just a jumping point, but just make sure when you get an opportunity, when the pandemic is over, when you feel comfortable to go out, or when they're open to the public, to go visit these research institutions. Last but not least, well, 2 things. Best way to learn resources is to explore them. Just spend some time playing around with the various things. Don't be afraid, you're not going to break them. Just play around with it so that you can learn more about how to use them and what resources are available. And last but not least, make sure to visit the research repositories. And I have a listing of the various ones that I recommend you visit so that you can learn more about what resources they have available to you that may help you with your research. And if you know one thing about me, I'm very interested in practical learning. So you actually have 2 homework assignments. The first one is on page 1, and it's listed there on your handout. Create one timeline for an individual, as well as create a list of your research locations. And the second one is on page 4, which is to visit those websites. No, it's actually on page 5, I'm sorry. To visit the website of the State Archives, State Library, and the other institutions listed to see if they have some information that might help you with your research. That being said, we have 5 minutes for questions. And again, do apologize for the technical difficulties. As Kayla said that you did not hear, this event is being recorded and it will be available on our website once, probably by Wednesday. So you'll be able to see it again in its entirety. So any questions?
One you just answered.
Okay.
Do you have any Freedmen Bureau documents?
Freedmen Bureau documents are federal documents. So that would be our next door neighbor, NARA. But there are some available on Family Search online too. So let's see. Here, let's do catalog. Let's do subject. Let's see if we can find it that way. But I know that we went through a huge, okay. So yes, they are online. They're on our own Family Search. And Here's a link to them. This isn't from the Research Wiki, and it gives you more information. It also gives you links on where you can find these records. Okay?
We have another question. I'm researching 2 individuals on the 1870 census. They are in the same household, with assumed wife and children each. One individual is 5 years older than the other. Can I assume that they are brothers? What is your experience with this type of listing?
Well, that can be your hypothesis. And then you have to do a little bit more research to determine whether or not they're actually related. So assumptions, you can make those, but you really want to look for more information to help confirm or deny that they're actually related. Because for all you know, it could be a cousin that was adopted by the family. It could be a child that was adopted who may not even be related. And it could just be somebody else and they listed them with the wrong last name. So that happens. So you have to take some information with from the census with a grain of salt until you find other records to confirm or deny what you see in the census.
Okay. Do you have NAACP for Atlanta or Georgia Archive documents at the Georgia Archives?
NAACP records, probably not. But you can ask us via Ask an Archivist questions, our form, which you can find here, which I did not show you guys, so I apologize. So in our big COVID announcement, this is where you can find the easiest way to find our link to Ask an Archivist. So if you want to ask that particular question or another one, or you want to make an appointment to come see us, this is the form that you would use to make that request.
Other ones. Lots of thank yous.
Awesome.
Thank you, this is very helpful. Thank you for your support, Taylor and crew for this program. So there's a lot of thank yous. But I believe that is all of the questions.
Okay, that being said, we're going to set up for one of my favorite speakers, who actually, she's my cousin, y'all, so she's my genealogy cousin. And I blame her for my career in genealogy because she, by virtue of being a great docent at the Oakland Cemetery and being a presenter at some of my early programs at the Wesley Chapel Library, she's the reason why I'm in genealogy now. So I'm pretty sure she's looking at me like, why are you telling all this? But hey, that's DL. And I'm thankful that I actually went before her, because once you hear her, you will realize why she's a hard act to follow. So that being said,
Dr. D.L. Henderson is a historian, genealogist, preservationist, and author whose research and writing focuses on the intersection of history, memory, and culture in African-American life and death. She received the Doctor of Arts degree in Humanities from Clark Atlanta University. And Dr. Henderson is a past president of the Metro Atlanta chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, our co-sponsor, and is currently serving on the Board of Advisors for the Historic Oakland Foundation, the Historic Southview Preservation Foundation, and Historic Rural Churches of Georgia. She also serves on the Cherokee Garden Library Acquisitions Committee at the Atlanta History Center. As a historian for Southview Cemetery, she researches, lectures, and conducts tours in cemetery history and the art and architecture of Southview and Oakland cemeteries. Dr. Henderson has received the Atlanta Urban Design Commission's Jenny D. Thurston Memorial Award to an outstanding preservation professional, and she has been recognized by the Atlanta City Council for her contribution to the preservation and interpretation of African American history and culture. She is the author of Southview, an African American City of the Dead. She is currently working on an Afrocentric history of Atlanta's Oakland Cemetery. Thank you, Dr. Henderson.
You want me to do it? No, that's it. Okay. Make sure everything works.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I am pleased to be able to share some of the research I've been doing, and I've been planning this book for a while, and I hope to complete it this year. Since the publication of my book on Southview, I've received a lot of questions about how I compiled the content for that book. So I thought I would spend my time today describing how I have researched and documented the lives of Oakland's Black residents in this forthcoming book. And I'll share with you drafts of some of the early chapters. I'll begin with a story. In the summer of 1850, just on the outskirts of Atlanta, 6 enslaved African Americans labored in captivity upon a 100-acre farm. The group consisted of 2 females, ages 65 and 20, along with 4 males, ages 14, 20, 24, and 30. Earlier that year, in the month of May, the farmer's wife had died, and he had made a grave for her on the farm. Only a few weeks later, he had sold the land, including his wife's gravesite, to the city of Atlanta to use for a public burial ground, later known as Oakland Cemetery. Most Georgia slaveholders in the mid-19th century held fewer than 5 persons in slavery, so the farmer, a white settler originally from Virginia, was already outside the norm. But by 1860, he would hold title to 11 enslaved Black laborers, including 5 children aged 15 and under. According to the 1860 U.S. Agricultural Census, the farmer had also increased his land holdings to 250 acres. The people he held in slavery would have been a major factor in the planting and harvesting of the crops that the farm produced in 1860. 125 bushels of wheat, 1,000 bushels of Indian corn, and 50 bushels of oats. Oakland Cemetery's records show that the white farmer buried at least 3 enslaved people in the Black section of the cemetery. 6-year-old Wash, who died of typhoid fever in 1857, 70-year-old Tom, who died of pneumonia in 1863, and an unidentified 16-year-old was buried in 1864. The farmer himself would join his wife in the cemetery's white section upon his death in 1878. Thus begins the history of Atlanta's oldest cemetery. The story of the white farmer and his wife's burial is well known among those who have an interest in Atlanta history, and specifically in Oakland. However, it came as a surprise to me when I discovered that few people seemed to know or care that the farmer had been a slaveholder. So it probably should not have been a surprise to me that there seemed to be little interest in talking about the enslaved people who had lived and worked upon the land before it became Oakland Cemetery. Well, that didn't work.
Okay, that's what I was
What's it
waiting
down?
on. I'm just trying to make sure it's back on, so. Oh. Okay.
Oh, I need to use this instead. Okay, thank you. So the history that I'm now writing about Oakland is the history of people that perhaps not everyone is interested in talking about, but their lives matter because it is their existence and their experiences that have helped shape the cultural landscape of Oakland Cemetery. You were stolen from your homes, but you were never lost. You left behind your stories for us to preserve. You will never be forgotten because your lives mattered. In writing this book, I follow in the footsteps of an early Black scholar, Reverend Edward Randolph Carter, who produced 2 Afrocentric histories of Atlanta in the late 19th century. In 1888, Carter published Biographical Sketches of Our Pulpit, a collection of life stories of religious personalities in Atlanta's Black churches. In 1894, he published The Black Side, a partial history of the business, religious, and educational side of the Negro in Atlanta. These books have provided many historians, including me, with a fine historical foundation for the continuing study of Black life in Atlanta. The inspiration for my book derives from Carter's depiction of the Black side of Atlanta and the lives of many Atlantans who now reside on the Black side of Oakland Cemetery. While some people question the need for separate histories today, it seems to me that researching the unique perceptions and experiences representing the various cultures and birthrights of the people who make up our diverse nation will always be appropriate, relevant, and necessary to enhance our understanding of the historical development of America and of ourselves as Americans. Too often, even well-intentioned inclusive histories will provide inadequate diversity of experience. I'm sorry, I missed my slide. There. Too often, even well-intentioned inclusive histories will provide inadequate diversity of experience, inaccurate and faulty interpretations of cultural practices, factual and yet not truthful representations of historical data, and incomplete outsider perspectives that do not properly address culturally specific circumstances. Afrocentric histories, and indeed any culturally specific history, can provide a corrective balance. Their specific cultural focus allows for more detailed and concentrated content and a deeper, fuller cultural examination and analysis. My research interest in funerary history, art, and architecture stems from my lifelong passion for old cemeteries. As a volunteer for Oakland, I have researched and written numerous walking tours, including We Shall Overcome, African-American Stories from Civil War to Civil Rights, Death and Dying in 19th Century Atlanta, The Art and Architecture of Death, Oakland's Resident Writers, History, Mystery, and Mayhem, and Black Magnolias, a celebration of African-American women in Atlanta history. Research for these tours and other cemetery projects, including African-American Voices, a self-guided cell phone tour, have led me to study the parallels between the physical development of Oakland Cemetery and the social development of Atlanta from the 19th century to the present. As Atlanta's oldest cemetery, Oakland became the final resting place for nearly all Atlantans who died between 1850 and 1884, Black and white, wealthy and poor, immigrant and American born. Oakland is a microcosm of the city of Atlanta and thus reflects the city's history and its people. Within Oakland, the historic African-American burial ground is a microcosm of Black life in Atlanta, and Black history is inextricably bound to the history of the city. The Black residents of Oakland Cemetery represent a diverse group of Atlantans, Africans kidnapped and sold away from their home countries, first-generation Americans of African descent born into slavery or born free, emancipated slaves turned American citizens, first-generation free-born children, and their descendants. From slavery to freedom, through Reconstruction in the Jim Crow era, during the Civil Rights Movement and beyond, the changing status and circumstances of Black life can be mapped in the changing geography and physical characteristics of the cemetery. I've compiled my research into two formats to present in book form. Part one is a chronology. I started compiling the chronology in this book after my first year spent volunteering at Oakland. I had long before discovered that compiling chronologies was a great way to study for school exams and to understand the connections between people and events in my U.S. history class when I was still in middle school. So I compiled an Oakland chronology to identify milestones in Atlanta's history that provided context for the important moments in the lives of the cemetery's Black residents. This became the basis of my first Black history tour of Oakland. Several published chronologies have proven useful to me in my study of Atlanta history, especially George K. Lankovich's Atlanta, a chronological and documentary history, and Herman Mason's Going Against the Wind, a pictorial history of African Americans in Atlanta, and Franklin Garrett's Atlanta and Environs. The physical development of Oakland through time has been impacted by social, legal, and economic influences upon the city and its Black population. This tangible historical record can be used to trace the effect upon the cemetery landscape of issues and events in local, state, regional, and national race relations. The continuing changes to Oakland Cemetery, including past and current preservation and restoration efforts, have obscured some of history's physical evidence. However, it is still possible to examine and document various historical events to create a more complete record of the development of the cultural landscape of Oakland, with emphasis on the history of its Black residents. You may have already heard some of the famous people of Oakland's Black residents, including Bishop Wesley John Gaines, Dr. Roger Badger, Atlanta's first Black dentist, Carrie Steele Logan, the founder of the orphanage that still operates today, PTA founder Selena Sloan Butler, and of course, Atlanta's first Black mayor, Maynard Jackson. But this book strives to provide a holistic historical view of Black life in Atlanta, including people from all walks of life. The burial sites of Oakland's Black residents tell just one part of the story. From the opening of the cemetery in 1850, no doubt African Americans would have been buried in the city cemetery, but there are no surviving records of any burials at Oakland prior to 1853. So we do not know exactly where they might have been buried in those first 6 acres. By tradition, though, this area would have been segregated. In 1853, the Atlanta City Council minutes provide details on the opening of an area which would become known as Slave Square. It was specifically designated for the burial of the city's Black population. The end of the Civil War and the end of slavery created the need for another change in Oakland's landscape. The land for what is now known as the historic African American burial ground at Oakland was purchased in 1866 so that the city's Black residents could purchase burial space. In addition, areas designated for the poor were divided by race as well. I am sorry, I did not choose this mask for speaking, and is that all right? Okay, sorry about that. Hope this doesn't break your COVID protocol. Okay, let me catch my breath. I'll repeat that. The end of the Civil War and the end of slavery created the need for another change in Oakland's landscape. The land for what is now known as the historic African American burial ground at Oakland was purchased in 1866 so that the city's Black residents could buy burial space. In addition, areas designated for the poor were divided by race as well. A few people have suggested that the area was segregated because it was the only space available for purchase at the time. But at the same time, this section was acquired by the city. More land was purchased to extend Oakland for sale to white residents of the city. So that there's no confusion, this area of Oakland was purposely segregated by race in the 19th century and maintained in that manner as its existence demonstrates today. The premise of my book is that the same forces which impacted the lives of Black Atlantans equally impacted the development of Oakland's landscape, and not just in the Black sections, but these influences affected the cemetery's policies and practices as a whole. There are numerous examples of this relationship of societal influences upon the cultural landscape of the cemetery, as the chronology makes clear. The final version of the chronology will describe local, state, and national events with emphasis on those milestone dates that I feel significantly impacted the lives of African Americans in Atlanta. Layered within those historical events, I have included details regarding the historical development of Oakland, particularly those changes that affected the burials of African Americans and reflected the changing racial climate in the city. I've chosen various details highlighting the lives of Oakland's Black residents and merged them into the historical details of the chronology to provide insight into the challenges and opportunities that many Black residents have faced individually and collectively throughout the history and development of the city of Atlanta. The chronology in my book, like others before it, of course, is not exhaustive. it would be impossible to include all of the people and events relevant to the Black history of Oakland Cemetery and the city of Atlanta. The chronology is divided into historical time periods, and each is a chapter. However, unlike some more recent chronologies, each chapter is preceded by a short essay, providing an introduction and context for the time period. I think this difference is especially important because in my experience in interpreting Atlanta's history, I have often encountered people who do not know or understand the context in which events were taking place in our city's past. This has kept them from understanding the significance of certain events and their impact on our city's development. Here's an example from 1850, the year Oakland Cemetery opened. Because so many slaves were escaping from the South to free states, the U.S. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act in September that year. The act required that escaped slaves be returned to their slaveholders, and officials and citizens of free states had to cooperate. The act strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which had put into effect the Fugitive Slave Clause in the U.S. Constitution. The illustration accompanying this entry in the chronology was a warning issued to fugitive slaves that a raid was planned in the community. Fugitive slaves, attention, the slave hunter is among us. Be on your guard. An arrest is planned for tonight. Be ready to receive them whenever they come. The last line, be ready to receive them whenever they come, might also be addressed to those who were harboring runaways, warning them to be ready if the slave hunter showed up, or it could be interpreted as a caution to be ready to take in fugitive slaves who would be running to escape the slave hunter. Advertisements for runaway slaves appeared routinely in local newspapers prior to the Civil War. This ad appeared in the Atlanta Daily Chronicle and Sentinel on July 6, 1850. $50 reward. Ran away from the subscriber on Sunday night last, my Negro boy Randall. He was last seen at Atlanta going on board the state road cars, and he has probably attempted to reach Chattanooga or some point on the line. Randall is of a yellow complexion, about 20 years of age, 5 feet 8 inches high, large full eye, good teeth, and stammers. Shows confusion when spoken to or conversing. The above reward will be given for his apprehension and delivery to me in Augusta, or $25 for his confinement in any jail so that I can get him. The ad was signed Augustine Frederick. Runaway slaves like Randall might have traveled to Atlanta to gain distance from their slaveholders before hopping a train to freedom in the North. Though the slaveholder describes Randall's stutter and his apparent difficulty in communicating, Randall's escape and his continuing evasion of the law demonstrates his initiative, intelligence, and courage. The escalating number of escaped slaves was an indicator of the increasingly chaotic conditions in Atlanta. Robert Yancey, who was buried at Oakland, arrived in Atlanta with his slaveholder in 1856. He started a barbershop and paid the slaveholder $150 for his time. By the beginning of the Civil War, Robert Yancey was operating 2 barbershops and living with his wife Bess in their home on Houston Street, apart from his slaveholder. While Yancey's quasi-freedom was not the norm in pre-Civil War Atlanta, though there were several other enslaved businessmen who, in violation of the law, were also hiring their own time, it serves as an example of the dramatic changes taking place in the city. In contrast to Yancey's apparent privileges, or perhaps even because of these types of pressures on a slave society, the very next year, in March 1857, in Dred Scott versus Sanford, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Black persons, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens and therefore not protected by the United States Constitution. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court stated that Black people had no rights which any white man was bound to respect. Robert Yancey's quasi-free status in Atlanta was perilous at best and indefensible legally. Meanwhile, at Oakland that summer, an ordinance protecting cemetery property, grave sites, monuments, plants, and trees had been passed by the Atlanta City Council. The fine for whites violating the ordinance was $50 with possible jail time. For persons of color, the fine was lower, set at $30. Failure to pay the fine for free persons of color resulted in being sold from the steps of City Hall to earn the amount to pay the fine, plus 39 lashes. Enslaved persons received no more than 75 lashes. So the city's policy for violations of the cemetery ordinance reflected the attitudes and laws regarding race that were prevalent not only in the South, but across the nation. There are specific advantages to using the chronology format. The overview of each chapter provides a historical context for a specific span of time. Readers can skim and scan for dates and names of individuals, and the names of Black Oakland residents in the chronology are bolded for easy identification, and the names are indexed wherever they appear in the book. And by comparing dates across time spans, it is possible to identify historical patterns. An example of a national occurrence with local impact on Black life in Atlanta happened in February 1874, when Black Oakland residents Romulus Moore, C.C. Wimbish Sr., and James Tate were among the petitioners requesting a speedy passage of the Civil Rights Bill through the U.S. House of Representatives. On March 1st, 1875, the act became law. The act entitled all persons in the U.S. to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodation, advantages, facilities, and privileges of inns, public conveyances on land and water, theaters, and other places of public amusement. The law did not desegregate schools, churches, or cemeteries. On March 5th, a group of Black men in Atlanta tested the Civil Rights Act by visiting bar rooms and billiard saloons asking for service. They were turned away from all but one saloon. Similar protests took place in cities throughout the South. Though the Atlanta protesters were not physically abused, some protesters in other cities were met with violence, at times resulting in their deaths. On March 11th, Robert Samuel Smith was buried at Oakland. He was a 20-year-old barber who died after shooting himself in the heart with a pistol. A few days before his death, Smith had signed an affidavit published in the Atlanta Constitution that disavowed his participation in the recent civil rights protests against the segregated bars and billiard saloons of Atlanta. Though some people connected his death to the protests, Smith's suicide note left a message for a young lady of his acquaintance, though her name was not revealed. Moving forward in the chronology to 1883, the Supreme Court ruled the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional because it could not regulate the behavior of corporations and individuals. The next Civil Rights Acts would not be passed for more than 80 years in 1957 to create the Civil Rights Commission. The Civil Rights Act of 1960 strengthened the Voting Rights Act. Fast forward to 2015, when the U.S. Supreme Court declared part of the Voting Rights Act outdated. On December 6, 2019, the Voting Rights Advancement Act passed the U.S. House of Representatives and was renamed the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2020 on July 27, 2020. And the fight to secure voting rights continues locally and on a national scale. Another foundational concept that I hope to illustrate in this book is this: if we do not know our history, then we will not know when we are repeating it. And we are repeating it. That's a trend that the chronology shows, and that many of you are already aware of. The necrology is the second organizing format that I have used for this book. There is one for each chapter. Necessarily, they are representative, not exhaustive, and the information included for the individuals in each chapter is different. The differences are typically based upon the type and amount of data collected by the cemetery for interments made during a specific time span. The individuals in the necrology are listed by date of burial, which is the date recorded in Oakland's records, which is typically not the date of death. Cause of death was usually listed in the burial records until the early 20th century, though some records before that time also failed to include that information. When the cause of death is archaic, I explain it in modern terms. The records kept for African Americans are usually less thorough than those for whites, and they often lack burial location information, though some grave locations are identifiable today because of their grave markers. Documentation of pauper burials of either race generally did not include a specific burial location. Each necrology segment begins with a biographical sketch of a resident who died during that time period. The first documented burial of an African American Oakland took place in early 1853. This is John's story. On Thursday, February 10th, 1853, a 14-year-old known only as John was buried in Row 1 South, Grave 1 of Slave Square. John's listing in the city cemetery's records as the first burial in Slave Square is the only documentation that has yet been identified regarding his short life and death. John was born about 1839 in Fayette County, Georgia, and his cause of death is listed as complicated diseases, a term indicating that young John suffered from various, certainly serious, medical problems prior to his death. Though born in Fayette County, somehow John was brought to Atlanta. In what manner, or for what purpose, or for how long he had resided in Atlanta is unknown. Nothing is known of John's parents or whether he had siblings. His life as an enslaved child, the type of work he performed as a slave, and how this may have contributed to his death remains a mystery. No physical description of John exists, nor is there a record of his medical treatment or the length of time that he might have been suffering from the ailments that ultimately caused his death. However, the cemetery record does include the name of John Slaveholder, who would have been required by law to arrange for John's burial. John Slaveholder was a prosperous dry goods merchant and one of the wealthiest men in Atlanta when he died in 1868. He was buried in the white section of the cemetery. After I published my book on the history of Southview Cemetery, I noticed that people always asked how I chose which individuals to include. In time, I began to realize that that actually meant, why isn't my family in the book? For my Oakland history, I'm using basically the same criteria to select individuals and families that I used for Southview. Oakland residents whose lives or deaths represented a trend in morbidity and mortality are included, and I have included the deaths of individuals who succumbed under special circumstances, such as a sudden or suspicious death, for example, through murder or other violent means. I chose to list the burials of some widely known individuals because of a significant achievement, such as a professional occupation, high level of educational attainment or economic success, or a unique contribution to society. I also included residents whose accomplishments may not have been documented broadly during their lives or widely recognized after their deaths. For balance and diversity, I included everyday individuals whose lives were personally interesting to me in some manner. For those whose deaths and burials were described in the local newspapers, I added details of their last illness or cause of death and the descriptions of their funerals, especially in cases where graveside services were held at Oakland. In a couple of instances, I described an individual's final instructions regarding their burial arrangements, as noted in their last will and testament. Essentially, the necrology provides a descriptive means of organizing and documenting the lives and deaths of both prominent and lesser-known Black residents of Oakland. For most of the residents who have grave markers, I've included photos of their memorials and some longer biographies, like the one for Courtney Beale and his wife, Isabella Gaines Beale. Courtney Beale was a successful entrepreneur and businessman. He worked in a variety of occupations: livery stable owner, trader, shoemaker, grocer, and drayman. Beale was born in Athens, Georgia, about 1831. In 1867, he was elected to serve on the Board of Registers in Reconstruction District 33, which included Banks, Hall, and Jackson counties. The Black registrars chosen from the various districts tended to be well known in their local areas. Many, like Beale, were literate, owned businesses, and invested in real estate. Beale owned multiple properties in Athens and Atlanta. When the Freedmen's Bureau established the Knox Institute in Athens, Georgia in 1867, 3 Black men, including Courtney Beale, donated the land for the school to, quote, educate freedmen's children or children of any race, end quote. That same year, Beale requested and was granted a liquor license in Athens, that allowed him to sell alcohol as part of his existing business. And by 1869, he was also operating a livery stable on Clayton Street in Athens. He advertised, quote, a stock of good, reliable horses, buggies, carriages, wagons, etc., end quote. The 1870 census for Athens, Georgia listed Beale and his first wife, Ellen, and 4 children, Laveria, Ambrosia, Ellen, and Euphrasia. Mrs. Beale and the children are also listed on Beale's 1872 Freedmen's Bank record, along with his parents, Langston, possibly Lancaster, and Tina. Beale was reportedly born free, though the circumstances of his birth remain unknown. After Ellen's death sometime in the mid-1870s, Beale married again. He and second wife Isabella Gaines had one surviving child, a daughter they named Josephine Ophelia. Isabella Gaines was the daughter of Josephine Andrews and Stephen Gaines, the eldest brother of Bishop Wesley John Gaines. In 1874, the Southern Watchman newspaper noted that Beale was the wealthiest Black man in Georgia. That year, Beale paid taxes on $10,800 worth of property. While he apparently maintained his family residence in Athens at least until 1880, Beale was listed in the Atlanta City Directory from 1874 through 1887, and he operated several businesses in Atlanta during that time. He also owned a multi-family dwelling at 85 Houston Street, and various Beale family members resided there. In 1880, Beale's daughters, Florida and Euphrasia, lived at 85 Houston while they were attending school in Atlanta. Their stepmother, Isabella, a seamstress, also lived there, and she worked as a tailorist for Oakland resident William Finch, who operated a tailor shop. Isabella Beale had learned her trade at an early age from her parents. From them, she also learned the habit of thrift. She saved her earnings from those early years and eventually purchased property and constructed 2 houses, which earned a profitable rental income. In 1887, Courtney Beale died in Atlanta when the wagon he was driving was struck by a freight train at the Edgewood Crossing on the Georgia Railroad. Initially, the doctor for the railroad determined that Beale's wounds were not especially serious, but Beale would later die of his injuries. Following her husband's death, Isabella Beale continued to live and work in Atlanta until the 1890s. By 1900, however, she had relocated to West Newton, Massachusetts. A letter she wrote to the National Negro Business League, introducing her newly established business in West Newton, was published in the proceedings for the League's first national meeting held in Boston that year. Here's a portrait of Mrs. Beale that accompanied an article in the Colored American newspaper that announced the opening of her business in 1910. Isabella B. Beale spent the last few years of her life in Louisville, Kentucky, where she lived with her daughter and son-in-law, William Baxter Matthews. The Beales are just one example from the many Black residents at Oakland whose stories enrich our knowledge of the history of Atlanta. You may have recognized some of the other names that I mentioned in their story, including the Gaines, Lucky, and Matthews families. There are many stories yet to be told at Oakland, and my purpose in this book is to research and document more of them, to cover Black Oakland residents from all walks of life, and to explain how their lives and experiences fit into the history of the city, the South, and the nation. I thought some of you might be interested in the types of resources that I used in my research beyond burial records and the books that I've already mentioned. Original historical records such as federal and state censuses, city directories, school catalogs, local newspaper articles, and obituaries provided the basic biographical information for most individuals. Other important resources included compiled biographies, Freedmen's Bureau records, church histories, court records, local histories, death certificates, marriage records, military service records, tax and land records, probate files and wills, and voter registration records. Many of these are available online, fortunately. Some online services, such as Google Books, have provided invaluable information for accessing both original and secondary resources during the pandemic. For the second half of the 20th century and early 21st century, resources are more abundant. but original records still help fill out the early history and family background of some residents of the cemetery. For information on Atlanta City ordinances and legal actions concerning the cemetery, I mostly use the Atlanta City Council minutes and the annual cemetery reports. These are available at the Atlanta History Center. Summaries of the City Council minutes also appear in newspapers, and the cemetery sexton's reports were sometimes published in the newspaper as well. General information about the cemetery that was of interest to the public also sometimes appeared in the newspaper. The Atlanta History Center houses the city's records for Oakland Cemetery. I am often asked about my research methodology, so I've summarized it here. My methodology is simple, just these basic steps. Person by person, from center to edge, from edge to center, coloring in the faces, then repeat. The author, Anne Lamott, has written a book about writing, and she tells a story about her younger brother who had been assigned a school report on birds. Of course, the 8-year-old had waited until the night before to begin. So he's sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of books on birds spread out around him, and he's in tears. Lamont says her father put his arm around her brother's shoulders and said, "Just take it bird by bird, buddy, bird by bird." So that's my first step. I take it person by person, consulting every resource I can think of to identify as much as I can about a single person first. And then I start with one person, the center, and work outwards, looking for connections within a family, a census neighborhood, correlating with local events, broadening the context as I go to the edge of possibilities. I also take the opposite approach, starting from the edge, perhaps with an event of enormous proportion like the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and follow its path and its impact back to the perspective of an individual. That process can make a complex situation more understandable and bring history to life through the unique perspective of an individual. When I was young, I loved coloring books. Actually, I still like to draw in color. But at school one day, I noticed that the other kids weren't coloring the faces. You know, there were people on the coloring pages we were given at school, and I always colored in the faces, even though the other kids weren't doing that. Somehow those blank faces didn't look right to me. So I used a variety of shades, using most of the 64 crayons in the box to create all the variations of brown and black-skinned people in my small world. And I continue to try to do the same today. I look for details that help paint a picture, providing shades and hues and texture to bring history to life through the experiences of people of color. So that's my basic methodology for research still today. Person by person, from center to edge and back again, coloring in the faces, then repeat. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today about my research and writing. Perhaps in the future, when we look back to our place in the chronology, we will see the beginning of a pattern or trend in history that helped move us forward toward positive change and growth. I appreciate your interest and attention. Thank you.
Any questions? Okay, don't have any questions right now.
Okay.
Just wanted to ask if anyone has any questions.
Does anyone have any questions for me? Is anyone out there?
This was good. No questions.
No questions? Okay. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us. And again, these programs will be available on our YouTube channel next week. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.